Welcome to Around the World with Dane Waters. I hope all of you are doing well today. So let's just talk about some of the quick headlines. In Mexico, I guess the most wanted drug leader, drug cartel pin, whatever you want to call him, was murdered yesterday. But it's interesting. They talk about how they flew him out in a helicopter. I just want to make sure that they actually flew him out in a helicopter and he isn't just didn't get away, didn't pay $1 billion to get away. We'll have to wait and see on that one. But I do see that the war on drugs in the Americas is really taking hold, and I think that's a very important thing that we have to do is that we have to diminish drugs in this world. There's no doubt about it. And so if the Mexicans are doing their part, the Trump administration is doing their part, and then we'll see what happens in the rest of the Caribbean basin and that area. This is going on. As far as Jeffrey Epstein is concerned, we've talked about it before. Former Prince Andrew was arrested. And now the former ambassador to the United States, the former British ambassador to the United States, Mandelson, has been arrested. And let me just be very clear: these are not over sex issues. These are over the fact that it's been disclosed by the release of the files in the FBI that they were involved in basically selling state secrets to Epstein. So that's something that is really going to probably bring down the Starmer administration. He's hanging on by a thread, and we'll see what happens there. We're going to be talking about that next week. Back to Around the World with Dane Waters. Excuse me, I'm all choked up. Just was talking to my guest about things before we get started here. Dan, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, glad to be here, Dane. Thank you.
So, Dan, let's get started first by letting you tell us about yourself and we'll focus on.
Sure. I'm an Israel-based Middle East affairs, foreign affairs, defense affairs analyst, and I'm one of the co-founders and co-editors of a platform called Middle East 24. As you can, and we cover broadly the Middle East and North Africa region from a variety of on-the-ground, authentic perspectives. So we are on social media, and people are welcome to follow us at Middle East 24.
Well, great. Oh, the Middle East, I mean, it's a constantly evolving, what's going on, whether it's Syria, whether it's in Lebanon or whatever it may be. But today we want to talk about Iran and what's going on there. And so give us your take on currently happening with the Trump administration, talking to Iran. I mean, it'd be interesting to hear an insider's take on that.
Sure. The Iran obviously, for those just waking up or have been living under a rock for the last 30 years, has been the main engine of radicalism and instability in the region, and really, if you want, a lot of radicalism around the world. And they've been pursuing aggressively a nuclear weapon. This administration, just like previous administrations, has set out to halt it from being able to achieve that goal. An interim deal, a short-term deal, was achieved during the Obama era, and then, of course, the Trump administration decided to undo that, ostensibly with the goal of getting a better and more stringent nuclear agreement, and that's where we are now. The United States has amassed a massive amount of force in the Gulf region, in the Indian Ocean, also in the Mediterranean, more firepower and manpower than it has amassed since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And they are heading now into the second round of negotiations with the Iranians under Omani auspices in Geneva. I know it's a lot to put into one sentence there. And from everything we're seeing and hearing, of course, it's always very hard to know what's happening. Certainly with this administration, with the Iranians, how much of it is bluff? How much of it do they mean? Will the United States use force or not? The Iranians are, of course, threatening massive retaliation in that case. And all of this, I have to say, comes on in the background of the last couple of months of massive protests against the regime by the people of Iran. And it's not something that's never happened before, but the scale of what we're talking about is hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in Iran have taken to the streets demanding freedom, demanding the downfall of this regime. And in an attempt to squash this, the regime has massacred and anywhere from tens of thousands to people are even saying 100,000 or more unarmed protesters in the streets of Iran over the last couple of months. And this is something unprecedented. And so this is the kind of setting that we see ourselves in heading now into this second round of negotiations.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the protests in the streets. I mean, I've always been a strong supporter of regime change in Iran. It seems to me that with those protests, it was a tremendous opportunity for regime change, and I really hope, that the Trump administration actually. I mean, there's two tracks here. There's the nuclear negotiations, trying to ensure that Iran does not have nuclear weapons. And then there's a possibility of regime change. I mean, to me personally, I think one of the best ways, the first goal is for regime change. But let's talk about, on the Iranian, I mean, on the nuclear deal. Wait, what is the ultimate goal? Like in these negotiations, I mean, for somebody in the Middle East, somebody in Israel, and around the world, what is success? What is success?
Well, if you're only talking about the nuclear aspect, right? And as you said, they do go together. There is a connectivity between the nuclear, between the regime, and the other elements, of course, that the United States is bringing up and insisting on, and that were supposed to be, but then not included at the last minute in the 2015 JCPOA agreements, is Iran's ballistic missile program, which has only offensive intentions, and its massive support for regional terrorist extremist proxies around the region. So, first of all, when we're talking about the nuclear program, the stated goal of the United States is to make sure Iran does not have the capacity to break out, to develop a nuclear weapon. And what the United States is insisting on, of course, is that Iran does not even have the ability to enrich uranium in Iranian territory. And so this is kind of the first hang up here. And so you could say, well, one success would be limited to the nuclear element, and that Iran gives up the right to nuclear enrichment, or maybe some kind of only symbolic nuclear enrichment. Of course, there are three different levels of nuclear enrichment. You have for civilian power purposes, Iran does have a civilian plant in Bushehr, the plant that's built by the Russians, and then that's at around 3.5% enrichment. And then, of course, you have medical isotope enrichment, which is just around 20%. And then, of course, you have the military grade enrichment, which is about 90% enriched uranium. And there's no reason why a country, certainly a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and a country seen as suspicious as the regime in Iran, should have none enrichment capacity. And so that would be one win if the United States can secure that Iran verifiably give up and state that it will give up the right to military grade nuclear enrichment, and maybe only keep a civilian or a medical or some kind of symbolic capacity. There's been talks about a consortium, a regional consortium, that other countries would then be a part of, and that Iran would have access to. And that's just on the nuclear part. And it's not clear if this regime is willing to trade what it has placed on a pedestal of credibility, of kind of national pride. Over these last few decades, it's pumped in hundreds of billions of dollars into this nuclear program. And it's just not clear that it's kind of tied it to its own identity, and its own national pride, and what it means to be an advanced nation. And that's even if it doesn't have any intent to ever use a nuclear weapon, which is a fanatical regime that has, propped up and spread destruction and terrorist groups around the region. So that's one element. And then, of course, how much is let's say the Iranian regime is willing to accede to some kind of meaningful limitations on that end. It seems that it is not at all willing to accept any kind of limitations or bans on its production of ballistic missiles or its support of proxy groups. And so, should the Iranian regime be willing to trade in those three, or meaningful concessions on those three elements, nuclear, missiles, proxies, then the United States, there are scenarios in which the regime makes meaningful concessions on just the nuclear aspect, and then you could see, the United States declaring success on this element and then calling off a strike. And that's where we stand now, is kind of seeing how far the United States is willing to push. They've amassed, as I said, a massive amount of force in the region. Are they willing to use it? And of course, the big questions that we still have is what does that mean? Well, we still we have no idea what the United States is planning or what it actually intends to do with that force that it's amassed in the region.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people talk about the reason there's such a massive force there is that it's Trump's way of negotiating, is that that they will force them to come to the table. Now, one of the things I have, one of the concerns I have, it goes back to it's about regime change because once again, I really do believe there needs to be regime change. So if you spend all this time negotiating a nuclear deal, it'll make it harder to have regime change because you cut a deal with people that you're still wishing would stay in power. So I think that once again we have a tremendous opportunity with the street protests and what's going on. We had a better opportunity a few weeks ago, a month ago, but it is what it is. But here I have a question for you that people typically ask is that okay, I know, we all know, most of us know that Iran is definitely not it's not a great regime. They are not good people. Well, the regime is not. This will be very clear about the regime, not the people themselves. Um, but how do you justify, like, people argue that, countries have the right to self-determination. What is the justification to say, hey, you country, X country, Iran in this case, are not allowed to have nuclear weapons? So, we, the greater world, is going to say no to you. How would you explain to the world that other countries have the right to tell a country they should not have nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I mean that's in theory that is a valid question, of course, and the issue here is first of all there was a regime that was accepted internationally, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that the majority of the world's countries, with the exception of a handful who achieved it kind of without it before this came into place, and then a couple other countries that snuck across the line, and then it was just accepted as a fait accompli. Of course, the United States, Russia, which was the Soviet Union, UK, France, and China were the original ones, the original the consistent members of the UN Security Council, and of course the Chinese achieved it at some point, and then later the Indians and the Pakistanis. And then it is widely believed that Israel has also developed a nuclear weapon, although it's never admitted it. And then North Korea, of course, in a very rogue manner, achieved a nuclear weapon, and no one is willing to go in and undo. Iran has proven itself under this regime to be a wonderfully irresponsible radical actor. And so enough of the international community, backed by a number of UN Security Council resolutions, have determined that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. That Iran, as I mentioned at the outset, the main engine of radical Islam, the main engine of proxy groups and terror groups around the region, is not a rational actor. It's not a responsible actor, and so it cannot be allowed. It cannot be allowed to have the most dangerous weapon on earth, whether it uses it for itself or whether it ensures that these proxy groups receive it. And that is, at the end of the day, I guess you can say international law and international norms are what enough countries agree on are international law and international norms. I mean, I guess there's no way around that at the end of the day.
Well, no, listen, I agree with you. I think if a country wants to, if they don't want to play fair with the rest of the world and they want to be a threat to the rest of the world, then the rest of the world has a responsibility to limit what their neighbor is trying to do. I mean, that's just a fact of human nature and human society. So let's talk about if there's not a nuclear deal. Okay, do you think that America should go in? Okay, let's say there's no deal. Then what happens? You think America should go in and do what?
Yeah, certainly what seems to be happening is America is amassing the forces in order to back its credible threat and show the Iranians that an agreement is preferable to them. And at this point, what it seems to be saying is that if you don't, then regime survival is what's on the line. Now, here are the big questions. The United States clearly has no appetite for an invasion of a country. We saw what this administration did in Venezuela. Iran is four times the size of Venezuela, if I'm not mistaken, and half a world away. So it's a much more complicated. It would be much more complicated. The United States did not famously and kind of tragically support the protesters when they were at their peak, when they were at their height. There was strong words from President Trump. We are coming, we're with you. Be strong. Words to those extent, and then tens of thousands were massacred in a 2 or 3 day period. The Iranian regime shipped in Shia militias from around the region, from Lebanon, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, to butcher, to massacre Iranians. And then now there's just countless stories of Iranians being executed in the political prisons of Iran. The scenarios that are being talked about could be anywhere from symbolic strikes on regime targets to actual strikes against, whether it's governance capabilities, police, command and control, intelligence stations. And then, of course, there could be a further degrading of any of Iran's military capabilities. It's very difficult to support or to enact a regime change from the air. In fact, it's impossible, right? That's not how regime change is done. And so, you could imagine a series of strikes that create chaos, that sort of decapitate the regime. I've seen reports that Iran's supreme leader Khamenei has appointed a successor in the case that he is taken out by the Americans. So you could see the supreme leader and a lot of the top leadership being taken out in these strikes, and that would be another major escalation here. And then, of course, that could create the space for these protesters. The big problem I'm seeing with the protesters and our conversation on regime change is that it's not just enough to have millions of people desperately frustrated with the regime, which is what you have in Iran. Is you have to have an alternative governance structure, right? And partly because of, I guess, the way Iranian society works, but partly because the regime has been so effective at brutally taking out any kind of political organization on the ground. It does not seem to be organized protests. Now, some of the scenarios that I've heard, and I don't know how much credence to give them, is that, and again, kind of similar to Venezuela, it's highly, I don't want to say highly, it's possible, it's likely that there is some kind of alternative leadership power structure within the regime that has struck some kind of deal with the United States. Um, and that, if the United States goes in and takes out some of the leadership, or if the leadership flees, um, they step in, and so it's not a full regime change, but it's kind of a leadership change within the regime. And so that's another option. And then, of course, you could have all the way to full strikes, a sustained multi-week campaign that just goes to completely degrade, decapitate, take away any of the regime's capability to lead, to govern, to terrorize the citizens, but most importantly, to defend itself, to fight back, taking out missile capabilities, taking out Iranian naval capabilities, taking out what's left of their air defense capabilities, if they have any, going back to the nuclear program and ensuring that it's even deeper under rubble. So there's a number of scenarios here. And again, frankly, nobody seems to have anything smart to say other than just, mapping out the various
Yeah.
scenarios that we have. And if it is strongly possible that if Iran does not bring something to the table after this next round of negotiations, and that's the kind of the 20-day period Trump gave, that's coming to an end soon, then you could see some action taken against Iran.
Well, I will be very clear that I think that I'm a little disappointed the fact that America did not act sooner when the tens of thousands of people were in the street, when we had the opportunity for, to me, real regime change. And you're absolutely right. People argue when people say all the time, why don't people take out Vladimir Putin? Well, the reality is, who comes after that could be worse than who Putin is. So unless you have a plan, it's just a matter of not just, it's not a matter of just killing the leaders of the country. You have to have a plan. So, and it's a complicated situation. You had the Brits who have said that, you can't use any of their airspace or any of their assets to attack Iran. But listen, I believe that we're at an opportunity that if we're going to do it now, let's do it. We've been playing around with Iran for what, 20 years, 30 years, whatever it is, 40 years since 79. And it's time just to really go in there and wholeheartedly do something. But you're exactly right. It's a matter of having a plan. It can't be like Iraq where you go in there and you say no person from the Ba'athist Party can serve in government, and then that was a definitely a problem, as we all know. Listen, I really appreciate you being on the show today, Dan. Sadly, we're out of time. That's excellent. You stay safe there in Israel, and I look forward to having you back on the show in the future. Okay, so
Absolutely. Glad to be
I
here.
appreciate it. Again, for being with me for Around the World with Dane Waters. Let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Thanks.